Thanks, Corey, for taking some time to chat with us today. It's always good to see you.
Yeah, you too. My pleasure.
So, I wanted to just kind of ask you some questions about what's going on in the pharmaceutical, in the drugs, and maybe biosimilars, and that whole life sciences area. There's a lot going on right now. The way I always try and explain it to people is that you can't really understand what's going on at the moment unless you look at it through the lens of what the administration is trying to do to reduce the cost of drugs. Do you think that's a fair way to look at this? Is it not fair? How do you look at it?
I think it's absolutely a fair way to look at this. I mean, when you see all of the threats to the IP system in our space today, they are almost invariably linked to a narrative about the allegedly high prices of drugs. And I should say, I mean, the price of drugs are in some cases high. What we would say is that is not a factor of IP in any way. It is a factor of a variety of different things, including a broken healthcare system that really puts pharmacy benefit managers and insurers and people in the insurance side of things ahead of innovators and healthcare professionals. It's a factor of out-of-pocket costs that are too high because the system, again, is broken. And it's also a factor, frankly, the price of innovation, ultimately has to be paid for if we want to have new drugs. I think that's a smaller part of it, but certainly, we do have a price problem in America, but it's not a problem that has anything to do with IP.
Yeah, and I want to come back to that in a minute and try and peel the layers to that onion. But you raised something that I think I understand what's going on, but at the same time, I don't really. It's hard to imagine. Sure. Is these PBMs, they're called, the pharmacy benefits managers, right?
Yeah.
I don't know whether they're responsible for this or not, but I've had a situation, and so has Renee, and I know other people have had the situation where you go to the doctor, they give you a prescription, and they give you a prescription to the generic so that it'll save money and likely your insurance will cover it. And then you find out that, well, the insurance doesn't cover the generic, but the insurance will cover the brand name, which just to me seems idiotic. And I don't know any other way to explain that other than if somebody's getting paid somewhere, is there a kickback there? I mean, and how much does that impact the overall cost of drugs?
Yeah, so I should say first, I'm not an expert on drug pricing and the whole pricing chain there, but as I understand it, and I know, there's even activity in Congress about this, looking at this, what the PBMs do is they're kind of, negotiating in between the insurer and the innovator, or the generic company as well. In many cases, and I think my understanding is the majority of them, because of the big three PBMs, are actually owned by either the pharmacies themselves or sometimes by the insurers themselves. So there's a lot of interaction and or integration, I should say there.
Yeah, a lot of self-dealing.
Exactly, self-dealing. And what their role is basically to negotiate a price that gets you on their particular formulary. But in doing that, what they've done is created this rebate system where they take, I think the public figure that I'm aware of is about 50% of the value of the drug. So when people talk about the price of a drug, up to 50% of that, sometimes maybe even more, is rebated back into the pockets of the PBM. So you have list price of $100, but really, what happens is the drug company gets paid $50. The 50 goes at some point back to the PBM, and then the patient is stuck having to pay, the copay based on the list price, not on the rebated price. Mm-hmm. So the patient ends up paying more. And in terms of your question, again, without being an expert here, my understanding is that whether or not you're on the formulary, is a product of that negotiation process. But again, I mean, as we're pointing out, nothing to do with IP.
No, it has nothing to do with IP.
Right.
And it's good to get that out there because I think I didn't realize it was 50-50. I mean, that's a pretty hefty cut for these PBMs.
These are the figures that I mean, again, this is not my area of expertise,
right.
But reading, the public narratives about this and public data, my understanding is that it's about something like 50% on average. I mean, probably depends on the particular drug or particular situation.
Right. Yeah. Everything depends. I mean, it's sort of the lawyer answer, right? And that's sort of how a lot of these misconceptions happen in this area, right? Because there's a lot of difference, a lot of variance, and there's not a lot of transparency. So they'll use this example or that example, and then also maybe we can talk about, maybe this is the right time to just talk about it, is sometimes the examples that are used are just, for lack of a better way of explaining it, fraudulent. With respect to, for example, IMAC, who has said, in your case at Novartis, you have close to 100 patents on a drug where you have like 6.
Yep.
I mean, it's hard to justify that as an innocent mistake.
Oh, it's certainly not an innocent mistake. I mean, it is, I think, all part of an intentional narrative trying to blame patents for the high drug pricing, issues that I think, as I said, do exist in this country. I say, I mean, the way we got here, I mean, I always refer to the 3 Ps, which are pricing, populism, and perception. There's lots of Ps, but this is how I like to think of it. And just to touch on this really quick, pricing I talked about right a minute ago. There's a broken healthcare system in the United States. Another statistic I always like to, just stepping back on pricing for a minute to keep in mind for, that most Americans shocks them. I think it's about 10 to 11% of overall healthcare spend in the United States is attributable to prescription drugs, which means about 90% of it or so has nothing to do with prescription drugs at all. So when people, say, oh, my insurance costs are high, my healthcare costs are high, and you sometimes see some of these activist groups either intentionally or sometimes inadvertently conflating healthcare costs or surveys saying, do you have trouble affording your healthcare costs? People assume that means drugs, but in reality, that's all the other things that go into healthcare, right? We all have I don't know if it's a true story, but people often, refer, I think, by proxy to the Band-Aid, right? The $50 Band-Aid that they get charged for in the hospital. But it is a fact, if you've ever been to a hospital, right, a doctor's visit, the amount that, if you don't have insurance especially, gets charged is kind of outrageous. And it shows you that the whole system, has all these issues. So that's one factor. I think on the pricing side, just start with that P. The other thing I haven't mentioned yet is, it's been an amazing period of innovation and breakthrough medical treatments in almost every field of medicine. One of the most recent ones not most recent, but ones that really was a triggering event, I think, for a lot of the scrutiny of drug pricing in America was the hepatitis C type drugs. And people looked at the price tag of those and said, oh, it's so expensive and it's a real problem. The reality is that if you look at the value that those drugs as one-time treatments, they were one of the first that came out and said, look, instead of having to be hospitalized with all these procedures to deal with hepatitis C and the impact on the body, we can do this one-time treatment with this class of drugs, and you're basically cured. And there's tons and tons of savings to the healthcare system compared to what it currently costs to treat that patient. So it's absolute value for the money. The problem there was really a financing problem, right? It's like when you buy a house, very few people can show up with a briefcase of cash and buy the house.
Right.
You need to mortgage it. That's not how the healthcare system is set up. It's set up to pay. And when you have, I think, in the case of hepatitis C, it was unusual because you had so many patients that really needed this treatment at once, that I think it was a real shock to healthcare systems around the world, and that created, I think, a finance situation for governments. So if you look back at the timing of this was around 2013, 2014. Looking back, I mean, there have always been fringe, either on the political side or groups that were complaining about drug pricing in the United States. But until around 2015 or so, 2015, 2016, this was not a mainstream issue. It was not something that was routinely, talked about in terms of high drug pricing. So that was one big factor. I think, like I said, another was people were starting to realize that healthcare costs in the overall system, were getting higher, and there were all these new entities, that were becoming more visible, like the PBMs. So these are some. The other one was there were some horrible examples out there of bad behavior. But I think it's important to note most of the ones that were pointed to of bad behavior on drug pricing were not innovative drug companies. And they had nothing to do with IP. So, Martin Shkreli was the famous one. He became they called him the pharma bro, as if he had something to do with the pharma industry when we think of innovative pharma, but he had nothing to do with that. He was a hedge fund guy who bought up a 50-year-old drug called Daraprim that was used for treating complications of HIV. He jacked up the price 5,000% of this generic drug. And, overnight people said, hey, look, there's a pricing problem in pharma. There were some other examples like EpiPen, another one that was not an innovative company. It was a generic that raised the price of that one. So all these things came together. And that's when you get to, I think, the populism side, the second P. This was, again, election of 2016. Think back for a minute. This was the Clinton-Trump, were the front runners. You had Bernie Sanders running as well. A lot of this drug pricing thing was really much more, on the Bernie Sanders side, the far left of the political spectrum, talking about drug pricing issues as an issue for those politics. And but then you had Trump picking it up because the polling had shown that because of all these factors I just mentioned, I think this had become kind of a mainstream issue. People were starting to realize that we do have an issue with high drug prices. Again, I think I want to be really clear, has nothing to do with IP, and even very little in most cases, I would say, to do with the price of innovation, innovative drugs. It's the system. But this became an issue. It became popular across the political spectrum. Clinton mentioned it in her campaign as well. It just became one of these big issues. And then the third thing, to get to your point, is the perception piece of it. I think we when you had the populism and the pricing, this is going to be a hot issue. The way that those two first P's are kind of what made drug pricing an issue, to your opening question, right? But why did that become an IP issue? That is all about perception, and it's all about how, unfortunately, groups in this Arnold Ventures funded network like IMAC, went in and filled this vacuum with all kinds of false narratives. One more thing I want to say before we maybe talk a little more about those false narratives and false facts that are being peddled around. I think one of the really important problems here that led to where we are today that really needs to be fixed is the unfortunate lack of education and lack of understanding about IP, not only among the public, which is maybe forgivable because it can be a complicated area, but among Congress. We think we have 535 members of Congress, adding up, of course, the 100 senators and the 435 members of the House. And if you look at how many of those collectively across both chambers really have an understanding and view IP as an important topic, it's probably no more than a dozen.
Which is shocking, and is also, and I'm sure that probably the maybe number is a little bit higher if you were to extend to like how many of them have some kind of understanding of pharmaceuticals or drugs or drug pricing, or because those are all issues that kind of live in the same space, and it almost seems to me to be malfeasance, and I don't think it's intentional. I just think it's neglect, and it's always shocked me on just like the CEO level in the US, for example. We have so many companies that if every piece of real property they own burnt to the ground overnight, the banks would be falling over themselves to give them whatever money they needed as long as they pledged their IP portfolio, whether it's like Coca-Cola's trademarks or whether it's some of one of the tech darlings in Silicon Valley pledged their patent portfolio. They'd have all the money they need at the greatest interest rate they could get, right? Because people, financiers, bankers, they understand how valuable this thing is. But then you have CEOs, CFOs, and general counsel who don't know anything, almost anything, about what attributes to 80 to 90% of the value of their own company.
Yeah.
And in this case, drugs and pharmaceuticals is a big issue for people. The way I always start the conversation is, look, drugs are more expensive than I want to pay. I assume they're more expensive than everybody wants to pay. But there's reasons for that. And with this being such an important issue to individuals, you would think just from a populist standpoint, which the populism seems to be growing in America, more people would try and understand what's really going on.
Yeah. I think that those are all great points, and I agree with you. I think the way I like to think of it, take a big step back. Again, particularly, I do think it's important for the public to have that education. It's crucial for people to understand how important IP has been to our history in this country, why we are world leaders. There's no doubt, that IP plays a major, major role in why the United States became a world leader, starting really in the earliest days of the country. But pivoting for a minute to the members of Congress and members of our government, to me, it really is a tragedy that they don't have a better understanding of it. So backing up, I know you know this, Gene, but for your viewers and listeners, it's important to remind people that patents and copyrights, IP, collectively are in the Constitution, right? They are, what I like to say when I talk about it, and it's really an amazing thing if you think about it, these are the only rights that our founders decided to give to individuals in the entire Constitution. Mm-hmm. Of course, we have our first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. They're amendments, right? They came after. Right. There's lots of reasons for that, which are beyond the scope of this discussion, right? But, why they were negotiated into the amendments rather than the body. But that's pretty remarkable that of the only thing that our founders, sat down and decided to put into the body of the Constitution that relates to individuals, whereas the rest is all about the structure of the government. They talk about, the power of Congress to make sure that individuals who innovate and create get the rights to their inventions and their writings. So that's the Progress Clause. The Progress Clause, as you probably know, was unanimously agreed to in the Constitutional Convention of 1787.
To the point where we almost don't have a whole lot of contemporaneous writing or explanation about it because everybody just agreed.
They just agreed. And it was the third act of Congress, 1790 Patent Act, first Patent Act, was the third thing that the very first Congress did. I mean, you'd think they had a lot of things going on starting a new country, but they said, hey, patents, let's make sure we pass that act right away. Yeah. And then fast forward to your bigger point, though, fast forward to today, right? I mean, what is the value of patents to this country? So there's I say this earlier stuff, there's a historical context and a government constitutional context that you would think every member of Congress should understand how important and integral it is to our system of government, right? As an economic tool that was so important for the founding of the country to take this young country that was suddenly off on its own, against the big boys around the world. It needed to have a way to grow itself and become competitive and self-sustaining. But then you look at the data. My understanding is that today, IP-dependent industries are about 40% of U.S. GDP, and about 90% of the value of the S&P 500 are tied up in IP. It's not all patents, it's patents and trademarks and copyright, but that should tell you something as well. Not to mention the fact that, and this is a fact, there are no drugs, not a single innovative drug or generic out there today that doesn't owe its existence to the patent system, right? Every generic started as an innovative one. And we have, the whole history, if you look at a timeline of the history of patents versus the history of medicine, you will find that there were no medicines, aside from just natural products that people tried out, right? No medicines that existed before patents were in place. Right. Medicine's only about 150 years old or so, the modern medicine, as we think about it.
Yeah, there's a lot here to talk about. We also know, like with the Bayh-Dole, we know that when the rights were too difficult to license, and then nobody licensed them from the federal government.
That's right.
And since Bayh-Dole passed, we've had over 153, I think it is, maybe more now, drugs and to go to market and out of university research. And it's because the universities have the right to license the patents to people who actually use them and take them to market. And a lot of those drugs are life-saving and or life-altering. We're talking about treatments for cancer. You're talking about treatments for heart disease. And so I always tell people that, like if you think Bayh-Dole is a bad idea, that made sense maybe in the late 70s, right? Because it was an experiment. It was an idea. It's like, the path we're on is not working. So let's try something new. Mm-hmm. If you're against Bayh-Dole in 2024, it's like, what is really your agenda? Because we know what happened. We know how successful it has been. Tens of thousands of companies started, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of jobs, and life-saving, life-altering treatment. I believe, huge advances in battery technology are owed to Bayh-Dole and the ability to license out. And so I don't understand the animosity towards patents. I mean, I get and maybe it's just this simple, is that I get that patents kill, which is what we both live in the greater DC area. You saw billboards.
Yep.
You saw buses with signs on them. You saw TV commercials
Yep.
during nationally televised football games, for example, saying patents kill. It fits on a bumper sticker. Is it really just that simple that that our explanation is a paragraph and theirs, which I don't think is correct and really trivializes the whole issue, but theirs fits on a bumper sticker.
So there's a lot to unpack there
Yeah.
that you just raised, but let me start. We'll circle back to the Bayh-Dole stuff.
Sure.
On that last point about patents kill. I mean, that's where I think this perception piece comes in, right? You had the populism, people upset about things, that you have the pricing issues for drugs, but even just more broadly about patents kill, right? You've got a lack of understanding and a lack of education, both at the political level and elected official level, and also among the general population. This is something they don't teach in schools. It's one of my big things. I would love to see mandatory IP education as part of the unit on the Constitution for the reasons I just said.
Yep.
Right? Understand why our founders thought it was so important and why it's so important today. But because that's not there, people don't have any understanding about connecting the dots as to why. They don't even know the difference, between a patent and a trademark and a copyright. And people can be forgiven. There's no opportunity to learn this. I don't think I learned this until I went to law school.
Right.
Or when I started doing some of my own writing and realizing, I could send back then a self-stamped copy into the Copyright Office to register it, right? Like, you don't teach these things. You need to figure them out yourself. And who's going to go and do that? And because people don't understand it, they are complicated. They can be complicated. Let's put it that way. There are aspects of patent law, as you know well, that can be very complicated. Mm-hmm. The general idea of them shouldn't be, but this is not taught. And because it's not taught and people don't understand, it creates a vacuum where those who have other interests and ulterior motives can come in and can fill it with, as we talked about before, completely fabricated data if they choose. False narratives that are not based on evidence. And we're in an age today, unfortunately, where these billboard, Twitter, whether it's Twitter statements or tweets or whatever they call them today, or billboards or bumper stickers, this is how people get influenced. It has nothing to do with IP, of course. It's just the way all issues today get communicated, and they can be very effective. And I think that's largely, where we are in the negativity around patents. If you actually dig in, as you already mentioned and we've talked about, if you actually check the data, if you can find any, because most of the time you don't see any data at all, you find that the data is off by orders of magnitudes on terms of things like patents. But if you say things enough times these days, then unfortunately it resonates. And I think that's why you see the patents kill type things. It makes no sense to say patents kill. I mean, if you're talking about, this was an ad campaign, as you know, around the COVID vaccines.
Right.
We would have everyone who understands it agrees, without the patents, well, all IP, but including trade secrets and know-how and patents, you would have no vaccines, not because the actual mRNA vaccines that came out got patents, but because of all of the innovation that happened up to that point. That's why we were able to get vaccines in record time, because they had been enabled by IP for decades going back. How can you say patents kill? Every single life that was saved by a vaccine is because patents save.
Right, and they do. And the whole thing, the thing that just irritates me so much is that, well, the government made the vaccines. No, the government didn't. The first patents that I could find that relate to that technology were granted to Johnson & Johnson. Well, I believe they were granted to a company that later Johnson & Johnson acquired. So it was in the Johnson & Johnson family, and they were researching in that area as well. And they go all the way back to 2002. So we know that they had to be researching that for years before that patent issued. It would have been in prosecution for several years. It would have been in research for at least several years before they filed the patent. So for over a generation before we had any virus, any need for these vaccines, pharmaceutical companies were researching this stuff, and that's what happened. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the government played a big role. They cleared a lot of red tape. They wanted to have a solution, but without private industry, there would have been a lot more deaths.
People also forget, just on that particular situation, which, by the way, I have to point out, and maybe we'll circle back after to Bidol, very different situation, Operation Warp Speed and all of that, and, the BARDA situation, very different than the normal type of funding that happens from the federal government, because in normal times, normal situations, the federal government does not fund drug companies in its research. They fund universities, they fund
Right.
maybe some startups in some situations, but it's not, the established companies that are doing the drug development that take direct government money. It's the licensing, as you mentioned. But during COVID, people also forget that, or don't understand that even when you look at that money, number one, not everyone took it. So like, on the Pfizer, BioNTech side, they decided to go the private way. I mean, BioNTech partnered with Pfizer and led to that vaccine. I don't think I don't know the facts exactly. I can't remember, but I don't think J&J was a big recipient of that money. Moderna is what most people focus on. And my understanding, again, I don't work for these companies, so I only know what I read publicly. But my understanding is that a lot of that money in Operation Warp Speed wasn't, to fund the creation of the vaccine, most of which had already been funded by private money years before. It was largely, at least a big chunk of it, was these kind of pre-commitment purchase agreements, right? Saying, you guys, here's some money maybe to get you over the finish line, but if you finish and if you sell the vaccine, we're going to commit to buy a certain number of doses in advance by giving you this money, and that is, part of the procurement process. So I think you have to also, if you're going to analyze these things and see how much money was given in, you talk about what was that money actually used for.
Yeah, it was used to buy the vaccines.
Right.
Now, the vaccine didn't exist at the time, so the companies used that to ramp up manufacturing and get everything across the finish line. But that wasn't a handout.
No.
That factored into the ultimate price at the end. So there's so much misinformation. And, one of the things that I just had a conversation, I won't name who it is, but a professional in the industry who, doesn't necessarily follow this specific space, but, pays attention to it like everybody in the industry does. We were talking about, well, what's wrong with negotiating a price? Because, and that gets us into the whole IRA.
Yeah.
And I know you've been here, on this stage talking to us about that during our life sciences program. I'd like to have you explain it, because it is shocking to people when I explain to them. And his response was, well, that's not a negotiation. Exactly. So for people who aren't familiar with what we're talking about, the federal government picked a bunch of drugs, and they are trying to push down the prices of the most common drugs used by Medicare, right? You want to take it from there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so this is part of the IRA, the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. There's a part of it called the Medicare drug price negotiation program, and the idea, it was marketed, to the American people by the administration as a way to finally, they claimed, negotiate drug prices with innovators for the Medicare system. Now, number one, again, not being a pricing expert, but this is my understanding. I do work for the industry. My understanding is that that drug prices have always been negotiated under the Medicare program, not maybe in the way people think, but the price has always been a derivative of what the negotiated private market price is. It's not what some politicians out there are saying. Drug companies just name any price they want, and the government's required to pay it. That was not the system before the IRA. The system was, there was a choice at the time. I think in 2003 or whenever Part D was established and enacted, there was a choice by Congress not to have the direct negotiation, and instead to kind of rely on the private market to negotiate prices. And then there's some complicated system of how the government pays a derivative of that. So that's number one, right? There was already a negotiation. In terms of what does the IRA do, they called it drug price negotiation, going around, as you said, the common refrain was, what's wrong with negotiation? And the answer really is nothing's wrong with negotiation. If it's arm's length negotiation, where you're actually, have equal ability at arm's length to discuss what are the various factors that should determine the value, a fair value, based on the actual, again, not cost, but cost has to be if it's real, value is a more important word than cost, right, or price. Something's not expensive if it reflects the proper value of a drug. So if you're going to take these factors like other countries do, quality adjusted life years, all these things, and negotiate based on those objective, ways to measure value, but also have an opportunity to go back and forth fairly, that's one thing, but that's not what this program does. What it does is it takes the drugs, depending on the year, I think it starts with 10, and then the following year it's another 10, and then 15 and 20 after that, year after year, once it kicks in 2026. And it will take the drugs that are the highest cost, this is very important here, before we even get to the negotiation point. The drugs that are the highest cost to the Medicare system, not the drugs that are the most expensive or that are unfairly priced. So one of our drugs is on there, a drug called Entresto. It's a heart failure drug. It is very commonly prescribed high volume because heart failure affects mostly the elderly. And it's one of the standards of care for heart failure. So it's a very common, popular, important drug. No one has ever said that drug is overpriced, that drug doesn't reflect its value, that drug's expensive, but it made the list because so many patients are on it. So that tells you something right there. The government's interest here is not reducing the price of overpriced drugs. The government's interest is cost savings to itself by spending less on what it spends the most on, even if it's the right price to begin with, right? So starting with that premise, if you're one of those drugs, there's no negotiation at the beginning. You start out with a automatic unilateral price cut that the government says, we're cutting your price anywhere between, I think it's 25 to 60% price cut, depending on how long that drug has been on the market without generic competition so far, right? Since its initial launch. So it's a minimum of a 25% price cut. So if your drug was fairly priced at $100 on the private market when you started, the maximum price the government will give you is $75, even if it was already fairly priced by every objective measure. From there, the quote-unquote negotiation begins downward. It cannot go up because they call that the maximum fair price. Cannot go up, has to go down, and basically every single factor, the way this is structured, every factor in it is held against you, including the fact that if you have more patents on the drug, you would think that that would be a factor that keeps the price high, because you'd say, oh, well, if you have patented components of this drug, it's innovative. The patent office said it was, it was innovation, so it's more valuable, so we'll pay for that. No, they actually use it against you and say, if there's patents, we're going to pay you less for it. So that's how, just to give you a glimpse. And then, of course, the other component of it is, of a real negotiation would be, well, if you're not happy with what the outcome is, you can walk away. Well, you can't do that here either, because under the IRA drug price negotiation program, if you don't like the price the government ultimately names, you basically have two choices. You can either pay what they call an excise tax, but it's really a punishment. It's a massive fine. It ranges from 187% to 1,900%. And the 1,900%, it mounts basically depending on how long you refuse to give the government the price it wants. We calculated out for our one drug that's on this list, that it would go up to about $90 billion per year, a $90 billion so-called tax if we don't give the government the price it wants. And the last option, the only other thing you can do, you cannot just refuse to sell that one drug. You can take your entire portfolio and entire business out of the Medicare program altogether, which not only, of course, would be financially crippling, because in the United States, the government is, the largest purchaser of drugs because of our system to make sure that American patients can get their drugs. But putting aside the financial impact that would be unsustainable for a company, you'd be depriving 157 million Americans of all the drugs that they need because they could no longer get their drugs from the Medicare system.
Right.
So it's, as they call Hobson's choice, right, in the law. I mean, it's no choice at all.
Yeah. Could you also just not sell that drug anymore? And would it, if you could do that, would it have to be, like in the U.S. or worldwide, or
that's a good. I think you can actually just stop selling that drug entirely in the United States, which, again, number one, of course, like any business,
that affects even more people.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's both sides to it. There's the the fact that we serve patients and we exist to make medicines that actually heal people and you know and hopefully one day, you know, even cure diseases. That's what we're in the business of doing. And there's the patient tragedy on that side, withdrawing a drug from the market, you know, entirely. You'd have to do that, of course, you know, I think from the entire market, not just the Medicare market, right? That's the point we made earlier. You'd have to withdraw that. You can't just withdraw that from Medicare. If you stop selling the drug altogether, I believe, I had to double check, but I believe you can do that. But again, taking the drug away from every patient in America, which would be unethical, right, and horrible, and no company would ever do that to its patients. And secondly, of course, there's the financial side to it. But there are countries that do this, right? And that is actually kind of the point. In a real negotiation, there have been situations in the UK where their system actually involves this health technology assessment agencies, right? These HTAs. Part of the government, NICE is the one in the UK, the National, I forgot exactly what it stands for, they actually do a real negotiation with the company, and if they can't reach an agreement, the company just doesn't offer its drug in the UK. And that, of course, you know, is a choice. Depending on how important the drug is, patients in those countries can petition their government and say that was a mistake, we want this drug. And, you know, of course, the political process takes over there. I'm not taking a position on whether that's right or wrong, but there at least there is, you know, the ability to arm's length negotiate a price, and if you can't reach an agreement, the particular drug can be withdrawn from the system. But that's because they don't have the same kind of, you know, system that we have here in the United States, particularly under IRA, where now you don't have that choice. You have to, you know, pull out your whole portfolio if you're going to sell the drug, or you have to, you know, give them the price they want.
Which is just unbelievable. I mean, nobody can call that a negotiation. And it seems to me, when I was sitting here listening to you talk about how they do that in the UK, is that's a responsible way to do it, because if the people don't like the decision being made, then they have recourse with their elected officials or the bureaucrats who are appointed by the elected officials. The buck stops with the government deciding not to move forward and susceptible to some pressure from the populace. Whereas here, the government's protected, the populace is protected, and this seems to be a recurring theme across all of these drug issues, is it is left to the industry to suck up and deal.
Yeah.
And that's no way to foster additional creativity and innovation.
It's not, and the data, by the way, backs all this up. So, like, one of the real consequences, long term, you know, we think of the IRA, or the drug. I should be clear that the drug price negotiation component of the IRA, because it's a much broader piece of legislation with all kinds of things in it. One of the real tragic consequences of it is that the data shows that in countries where there are price controls, there are fewer drugs launched. So there's one. I don't remember the exact numbers, but it shows in Germany, I mean, they have only something like, in Germany is probably the second largest market for drug launches in the world in terms of the number of drugs that's launched, but it's something like 15 or 20% fewer drugs are launched in Germany versus the United States, simply because of, you know, the pricing. I don't know all the details of their system, but the certain amount of, you know, price controls there, and it goes down from there depending on how drug prices are controlled in given markets. So those with higher drug price controls or more severe price controls get fewer drugs, and even if they get the drugs, there are delays in how long it takes to launch them because they don't get prioritized. So one of the predictions, unfortunately, or consequences, I should say, of this system, if it continues the way that it is envisioned, is that there will be less of an incentive to launch the newest drugs in the United States, or at least to launch them quickly. And there's lots of other impacts too, I should say. I mean, you know, the innovation impact is just unbelievable. The negative innovation impact of this, if it were to go forward, there will certainly be fewer new innovative drugs that can be invented and developed. And that's just simply a factor of economics, because what happens now is, I should say, you know, this is a good time to say it. I mean, the general statistics of our industry, just to remind those who don't follow our industry, the average cost of inventing one new drug is about $2.6 billion, I think, maybe even higher now. That was a few years old, that study. You know, so $2.5 billion, give or take, maybe a little higher. Still an 88% failure rate once you start your clinical trials. So only 12, and so this is not at the beginning. This is once you actually are going into the, into the clinic, testing on humans. 88% of the time you fail. Part of that, that's largely why the price of one successful drug is so high. What most people don't realize is that even when you scientifically succeed and get a safe and effective approved drug, only between, I think, 20 and 30% of all drugs will make back their R&D costs. So most drugs won't even make a financial return. And you usually make, like many businesses, right? You usually make your financial returns at the margins later on. It's the later years of your drug sales, because it takes a while to convince, and rightly so, right? To convince doctors and patients to switch from an existing drug to a better drug, for their disease, unless it's a totally, drug that has no current treatment. So you're making your money on the tail end. So remember what IRA does. I don't know if we said this actually today, so just to be clear, that price control takes effect at year 9 of a small molecule drug and year 13 of a large molecule or a biologic drug. Think about that. The patent system is supposed to give you 20 years of exclusivity for an invention, not the product, but on average, the drug industry gets around 13 to 14 years of exclusivity on average for their drugs. To point out, the IMAC lies about saying we have 30 to 50 years of exclusivity. We get about 13 to 14. But if this is coming in for small molecules and cutting you at year 9, it means that financial opportunity to make back that money, during which often comes in years 9 to 13, is now gone. So overall, you're going to make less money on the few drugs that actually even have a chance of succeeding, which means that you have less opportunity to reinvest that into R&D, which means fewer new drugs. 2 more quick things on consequences of this. You are certainly disincentivized to continue researching a molecule for a new use or a better version. Many drugs out there are completely new drugs for a new disease such as cancer, right? Well, we have one that started its life as a cancer drug, and we later on figured out, by adding it to a different ingredient and all these different things, it's actually effective in treating MS. Totally different disease, totally different reasons, but it actually works. So those kinds of new use research would be totally disincentivized, or will be, by this law, because you can no longer, at year 9, it's based on the molecule, not based on, if you launch that same drug with the same molecule for a totally different disease, the government doesn't care under this system. It still counts as being subject to that price control. So you have no incentive to continue innovating there. And the last thing, really important, this 9 to 13 year distinction, 9 years for small molecule traditional chemistry drugs, year 13 for biologics, it is going to, artificially skew the market towards biologics, which are not necessarily better. They can be, right? Biologics are really great medicines for a lot of different diseases, but they're not always the answer. There are some small molecule drugs, many, that are equally complex, equally expensive to make, and more important for certain diseases than biologics, but this is going to disincentivize, the investment in small molecule drugs.
Yeah, I've had a situation a few years ago where I got prescribed 2 different biologics. The first biologic I had an allergic reaction to, and then the second biologic I had another allergic reaction to. And, so it's not right for everybody. It's just not the right answer. And incentives, that's something I wanted to get to, because this industry, like any other industry, is going to follow the incentives. So if the incentives are to push into biologics, that's where more is going to go. More money, more time, more energy is going to go. Another thing that I was thinking as you were talking about this is that, if I were running a pharmaceutical company, I would have a conversation. I don't know that I would do it for sure, but I'd have a conversation that, maybe we don't want to be chasing drugs that service an aging population, because that's where Medicare kicks in, right? So it's over 65, more or less. It's the elderly. So maybe we need to be focusing on lifestyle drugs, aimed at a younger audience, or different things like that. And then it also kind of incentivizes not swinging for the fences, in that, I don't want to find something that everybody uses. Like you were saying with your drug Entresto, it's not expensive because it's expensive. It's expensive because so many people need it.
Yeah.
I mean, you'd be better off. You'd be better off if you had half the number of people taking that drug.
Yep.
Because then you could charge what it's really worth. And that's just stupid. That's just, I mean,
Yeah.
that can't make sense to anybody. I mean, I suppose it makes sense to people who are pushing beans around on a spreadsheet, you know, the bean counters. But to sane people, that's not the incentive. I want pharma investigating. I want the next greatest antibiotic. You know, every time we hear one of these outbreaks of antibiotic resistant stuff, I think, where are the incentives to try and push pharma in that direction? There are none. You know, and now there's even less than none, because if you got a really good antibiotic that everybody's going to be taking, well, government's going to be spending a lot of money on that.
No, there's a lot there. So you're absolutely right. I mean, so first I should say it's not a question of want. I mean, what we want to do is innovate breakthrough treatments for every disease that we possibly can.
The question is whether you can.
Exactly. Right. It's about what is actually feasible. Like I said before, you know, this stuff is expensive, it's risky, it's tough work. You're talking about human beings here and things that happen inside the body, right? Yeah. So it's very complicated. So there's a lot of investment that has to go into it. We want to be able to follow where the science takes us. Sure, we focus in certain disease areas and not all, because not everyone can do everything, and it's why different drug companies differentiate. And you know, we're more on the oncology and immunology and cardiovascular, side, and with some others, rare diseases as well, and cancer is huge for us. And some autoimmune as well. Anyway, but we want to be able to do all those things. We don't want to actually be in a situation where we have to follow what's going to be, you know, just the market opportunity. But you have to have both, because we are, at the end of the day, it's not just about even making money. It's about what is possible to enable the business that we do. I often get this question, like, why can't you just make the same, you know, money that a commodity, you know, this is what you see all the time, pushes from, you know, some you know, political, in some political discussions, why can't we just go to a cost plus model, right? They're pushing for whatever it takes to manufacture your drug. We'll give you, you know, a small percent on top of that, and that should be enough. And while that would be nice, you know, if it worked that way, but we can't survive, investing almost 20% at our company of our global net revenues back into R&D every year. It's close to about $10 billion a year of our own private money goes back into R&D every year. We couldn't invest at those levels if we're just making a small margin on top of the cost of manufacture. Right?
Yeah,
That's
just a small margin on the top of the ones that make money, you know.
Yeah, the few that make money.
Yeah,
exactly.
and that's the thing. I hear people saying along the same lines, you know, like cost plus, but then they're like, and why are we paying for all these drugs that didn't work out? And I've actually heard people say, you know, otherwise seemingly relatively intelligent people say, in America, we don't pay for failure. We pay for success. So why are we paying the pharmaceutical companies price for those drugs that make money when, in fact, a lot of that's going to pay for failures that didn't?
Right.
You know, and I think to myself, as a business owner, it's like, well, it's pretty simple. You know, if I can't recoup my costs, then the lights are off and we're out of business. We are going to help no one. We're going to lose lots of jobs, and the world's going to be worse off.
Yeah.
And I don't understand where this is coming from. Is that resonating in any way?
I mean, I should clarify. I mean, a really important distinction that some people, I think, don't quite understand. I mean, and understandably, they may not understand or have thought about it. We don't actually price in the price of failed, drugs into the price that we seek for a drug. Like, no one says, yeah, we have to account for the failure, so we're going to charge more for this given drug. We aim to price our drugs based on the value they deliver in a particular situation, and that value is complicated. There's lots of debate about what the right value formula for a drug is, but we try to look at the overall value to the patient compared to the standard of care, the savings to the healthcare system compared to the standard of care specific to that particular drug. So no one, is pricing drugs to say, let's also account for the failures in that way. But in the bigger picture, right, in terms of how much revenue do we need to make overall, like how much margin do we actually need for the overall portfolio of sales around the world to be able to sustain the level of research that we do, that has to account for the failures. And that, of course, linking back to your area and my area of expertise on IP, that's where the IP comes in, and why it's so important to be able to have that term of exclusivity, to be able to sell the drugs that do make it for the period of time that they do, right? So that, some people say, well, as soon as you make back the money you spent on that particular drug, the patent right should go away and it should be genericized. And it's like, well, no, because it's the price should be, based on the value, but the overall money that you make over the period of selling that drug needs to be enough so that you're able to reinvest in and sustain that R&D model. And I think that's the, kind of the nuance that maybe people don't understand. But I did want to clarify that, we're not going around pricing drugs based on the failure directly, like in the way that some people may think.
Right. No. And there was something that you just brought up that I wanted to get back to, and it was I lost it again.
Well, maybe I'll just comment quickly.
Go ahead.
You mentioned antibiotics, and that is a great example of what happens when there's no incentives. And that's not a patent failure, but it's a market failure. We are in a situation, as really a grievous situation with antibiotics, where there's so few left that can treat the more aggressive bacteria. And part of that is because the nature of antibiotics are such that the second you invent one that's more advanced, no one is going to want to use it, because we'll quickly get resistance for that too. You want to put it away and save it for when you really need it.
Right.
So it's not going to be prescribed in mass scale at the beginning, and maybe never, hopefully never, right? We don't want to be in a situation where we need it. So, but there's a disconnect there, because if you're going to, put all the money, and it's very complicated stuff, by the way, to come up with new antibiotics that work, right? If it was easy, people would be doing it, and cheap, right? So it's expensive, it's complicated, and the minute you invent it, it's going to be, maybe stockpiled to some extent, but put away. But that's not going to be enough to compensate for the work that it takes. So that's why it's an area where you do see, even in the U.S., there have been some acts of Congress that are trying to supplement the normal patent system with this. But it's a great example, to your point, of what happens in general when the market for something disappears. Even though we all want to, do certain things, we can't sustainably invest in research directions that have no incentives and that are, going to go generic or be price cut down to a non-market price immediately or too soon, to make it unsustainable.
Yeah, and I'm glad you raised that, because one of the things I think that we need to be trying to have a conversation about, and in this climate, this is going to be impossible to do at some point, hopefully when cooler heads prevail. But is the patent protection given to pharmaceuticals long enough? Not trying to shorten it up, but for that exact reason. I mean, there's a lot of things that I would like antibiotics, hope that pharmaceutical companies are continuing to research, and they're not going to make a lot of money. They can't make a lot of money. And by the time you do make a lot of money, that means that super strong antibiotic that you've come up with is no longer super strong, and now it's being regularly prescribed.
Yeah.
And hopefully that never happens. Maybe it does happen. But, I would like the best and brightest minds in the life sciences industry to be working on these things that hopefully we will never need.
Yeah.
And we have to have a structure for that. And maybe it's not the patent system. Maybe it's an add-on. We've done that in the past in this area to accommodate for the FDA delay. Maybe that needs to be more, at least in some circumstances.
Yeah, I think there's no question that longer patent terms would lead to more investment and more drugs. The question of whether it's long enough is a subjective one, and it really is. I agree with you. It's a societal conversation in some ways as to what we want. But if we want to encourage even the status quo, what I'll say is we need at least the term that we currently have. And again, let's go back to that IMAX stuff for a minute, because there's these outrageous claims out there based on absolutely either false data or no data that drugs are enjoying decades-long, monopolies, as they call them. We wouldn't say they're ever really monopolies, because there's always other competitors, other innovators, right, competing with you for the same disease, often in the same class of drugs. So it's not a monopoly. But the exclusive rights in the particular invention, there's these claims that it's 30 to 50 years is what IMAC and others like it say.
It's just ridiculous.
Yeah. It's ridiculous. I said it before, but let me just say it again. Small molecule drugs, study after study after study, confirms over decades that the average time for small molecule-based drugs is about 13 and a half years. It's less than that for the top-selling drugs, right? So the drugs that make the most money, it's more like 10 to 12 years is the average. There's a reason for that because, of course, the more money they make, the more attractive they are for generics to challenge them, more generics to challenge them sooner. On the biologics side, it's really too early to make judgment calls, but by my math, looking at how long, we don't have that many biologics to look at. I think it's something like 16 or 17 years if you just average out the time between the first launch of the first biologics and the time generics or biosimilars enter. But a lot of that is because we didn't have a biosimilars pathway in existence in the U.S. It was enacted in 2010. It did not actually get up and running with all the guidance from FDA and all that until like 2014 or 2015 or something like that. So we've had very little time to see how that plays out. But even if it's, 16 years on average for that, the point is we're getting less than the 20 years that, understanding that the patent system, the 20 years is per invention. The idea of the patent system, the policy rationale was that 20 years across all technologies is a fair period of how long you're supposed to be exclusive for a novel thing, right? That's the incentive that the system, regardless of technology, regardless of field, assigns. We get far less than that. On the drug side, the U.S. government, we have a 14-year minimum floor for the patent term extension system, which tells you that when there's delays, because in our industry, unlike other industries, we can't launch a medicine the minute we patent the active ingredient. We have to go through the 10 to 15-year development period, clinical trials, prove it's safe and effective before we can finally launch. So we get, the aim of that system is about 14 years, and we're still getting less than that. So the people who today say exclusivity is too long, it should be shorter, that would really, really negatively impact the industry. We should at least be able to maintain the status quo. But I would argue that, the status quo we're getting is not even as high as the system in general is supposed to be giving us. And that's an important conversation because I do think, that if it could be agreed, that there's a reasonable period, whatever that is, it should be higher than the 13, right? I mean, 15 was something, I'm not advocating one way or the other on this, but 15 years was something that was introduced in a set of bills called the Dormant Therapies Act and the Modern Cures Act around 2015. That was something that was being discussed and looked at seriously by the industry, as just a fixed period of 15 years by the time you launch. We'd have to really look at that now, before taking positions on that period, because, of course, the science has become more complex. We're now in the age of gene therapies, cell therapies, radioligand therapies with little radioactive particles, gene editing, right? Medicine is changing, so all those dynamics may change. My point only being that those who say the system currently, gives you too long a period, are A, lying with data, because the claims of 20 to 30 years are outrageous and false, and B, not, I think, appreciating that what we get now is significantly less than what every other industry gets.
It is, and it's just fraudulent. And the only way I think that they can do that is by misdirection and really just lying, right? They'll say that this drug gets 50 years of protection. It's like, no, that drug did not get any more protection length of time than any other drug. What you're conflating, apples and oranges, is that was something that was useful, something a lot of people needed, something a lot of people wanted, and we made it better. We made it incrementally better. Sometimes there's leaps that make it much better. So you're talking about the second, third, fourth, fifth generation, and that bears no relationship to the fact that the original underlying drug is now freely available, correct, no patent rights after about a decade or 12 years, as you were talking about. So if people want that original drug, they can have it.
Right.
They can't have the latest, greatest, the thing that just cost you 2.6 to, I've seen in some cases, probably because of the science and what you're trying to accomplish, estimates that it goes between 2 billion and 12 billion. I mean, sometimes these things cost a lot of money and take a lot of time. Yeah. And, that's just the way we don't have a patronage system. What we have is a market economy, and we compensate creators for what they do. And yeah, maybe it sucks that not everybody in the world can have that drug for practically free today.
Right.
But stick around for half a generation. And I always tell people that when you feel the worst and you go to the pharmacy, that's almost always when your pharmacy bill is the cheapest, right? Because these are antibiotics, these are, cough suppressants, these are, all kinds of things that are off patent. They've been off patent forever, and you look at it and you get 30 pills, and it's cheaper not to use your insurance because your copay for every drug would be $5, $10, $15, whatever it is. 30 pills might only be $2.50. $2.50, So you don't even use your insurance sometimes when you feel really bad. That's what we want across the board, but you have to get there.
And that's the life cycle, exactly. I mean, that's what I think people don't understand, that you can't have the generics. We said this before, right? Without the innovator drug paving the way. Ultimately, every single innovative drug becomes a generic drug, and the generic drug then becomes cheaper over time. But of course, you can't have that. They're not replacements for each other, right? Mm-hmm. They are just, the natural life cycle of something eventually becoming generic.
Right. So, and I'm glad that was the thing I slipped my mind at the moment. I'm glad maybe we could just end on this, because I think this will be a good thing to get out there. I had an event here, a patent portfolio management program at the end of June, and we had a lot of in-house attorneys, like several dozen, and they were high-ranking in-house attorneys. Just to give you an idea who the audience I was in, very few of them, almost none of them, were life sciences people. And I asked the question, and I forget where it came up or how it came up during the conversation we were having with the panel, but I asked the audience, by show of hands, how many of you think that when a drug loses patent protection, that generics always enter the market? There will be a generic enter the market. And almost everybody in this room put their hand up and said, yeah, generics enter the market once the patents expire. And that's simply not true, right?
Right.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say probably most of the time, generic drugs do enter the market at some point after either the patents expire or, in some cases when they're invalidated. But it's not the patents are not the only factor that determine whether or not there's, generic entry, for a variety of reasons. One of those reasons is that it depends on whether there's a market for a generic drug to come in. There are many drugs, frankly, and I said before, only 20 to 30% on average is the statistic that I'm aware of how many drugs make a profit. A lot of the reason why, and I also want to connect this to something I said earlier, where patents are not monopolies, right? For drugs, not at the product level. Part of the reason why not all of our innovative drugs make a profit is because they're not lucrative, because there's competition that comes on and basically eclipses even an innovative drug in terms of something else newer, better comes along, becomes the standard of care, or a better drug in the same class or to treat the same disease before your patents have even expired. So there's not even always an incentive for an innovator to keep a drug on the market if it's not as good as something else newer that comes along. So there are certain situations for sure that by the time an innovative drug, its patents expire, there's not a whole lot of incentive for a generic to come on. So you may, face a situation like that where the patents expire, but there's just not going to be any money in it. Don't forget, it's really important to remember that generic drug companies are not, a public service. they are not, part of the government, at least in this country, that's there to that's just being paid. They're a business.
They're
right?
a for-profit business, the same way
business.
that every other company in the world is.
And it's great. I mean, we at Novartis used to own Sandoz until last year. One of the biggest generic companies out there. It's an important business, and we, even though we've spun them off, that doesn't change our view of how important the generic drug business is to the life cycle. We don't want to keep making the same medicines as an innovator from now until the end of time. We want to move on. We want to contribute that to the field of medicine, treat patients, and then we want to reinvest the money that we can recoup on the global scale from all of our portfolio back into R&D and come out with the next treatment for the next disease and the next group of patients. So we don't want to keep making these drugs. We want generics to come in, but like I was saying, you have to have a market incentive for generics to do that. So that's not always going to be the case. there are many situations where there are drug shortages actually here in the United States of generic drugs, because there's either manufacturing issues or just not an incentive for generics to be investing in those drugs. And if you think about the portfolio, I mean, there are thousands of drugs that have been invented in the last 100 or so years. Not all of them are still available generically. Again, many of them have been eclipsed by better drugs. But some, there's just not a market to make. And then, of course, there's also things beyond patents that go into making medicines and being able to launch a medicine. It's not just right, the IP rights are one thing, but you also have to be able to have the technical ability to make it, the manufacturing capacity and expertise and know how to do it. Things like therapy, gene therapy, cell therapy, these aren't drugs like in the traditional sense, right? These are procedures that involve gene sequences and viral vectors to deliver either missing or broken copies of genes into the body. Gene editing is a hot emerging field in medicine where we're actually going in and changing the DNA of a particular cell to try to fix a disease situation. These are not things that are amenable necessarily to generics. There are also, exciting areas of innovation that we want to incentivize. So there's certainly not a one-to-one. I mean, like I said, though, at the same time, probably the majority of drugs, it is still the case that that once the patents are either expired or, in the cases where they're invalidated, that paves the way. But that's how the system is supposed to work.
Right.
That's why they're term limited, right? That's why the Constitution says limited times, because it's a trade-off and it's a balance, and you really want both.
No, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. That was a fascinating conversation.
Sure.
I really appreciate you being here, Corey.
No, my pleasure. Love to do it, and thanks again.
Good, thanks. All right, everyone, that's all we have for today, but we look forward to having you join us again next time. Bye for now.